So, to our webinar today on how to develop an energy performance contract project. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. If everyone can please keep your microphones muted for the session if possible. The webinar is going to be recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel if you'd like to view it again, or if you know anyone that might benefit from viewing it. Attendees can also join our DeliveREE Community of Best Practice group on LinkedIn if they'd like. We will have a question and answer session at the end, so please feel free to type any questions into the chat at any time. I'll go through them after the presentations. For any of you who might be new to us, Codema is Dublin's energy agency. We support city and public sector organisations in reducing carbon emissions and improving energy efficiency. This webinar is part of our DeliveREE project, which aims to make it easier for public sector bodies to deliver energy-saving projects using EPC contracts, helping to reduce energy use, decarbonise and improve buildings through guaranteed savings. We'll have two speakers today. First up is Joe. Joe Hayden is Codema's project implementation lead, and Joe will share main learnings from DeliveREE projects so far and what we've been working on. Next, we'll have Emily Clark, who's one of Codema's energy engineers, and she will take us through a step-by-step framework for developing an EPC project. Thanks for attending, and I'll pass it over to Joe.
Thanks, Rory. Get my slides going. So, yeah, thanks for joining us today. As Rory mentioned, I'm going to talk through, I suppose, a little bit of background to the DeliveREE project and how we got there, and more crucially, some of the lessons learned along the way, and how we've arrived at where we are today in terms of how we approach EPC and what we're thinking about it. So first of all, just a very little bit about Codema. We're the energy advisors to the 4 Dublin local authorities. We were founded in 1997 as not-for-profit, and there's 32, or maybe not 34 of us now in Temple Bar. We provide services in energy monitoring and management, energy awareness, policy planning, project management, and funding. But we've also acted as project facilitators for performance contract now for 10 years. This came mainly through our involvement in European funded projects such as Guarantee, Easy 2020, Interreg. And through this, we also are working with SEAI, and we developed a training project on program on EPC facilitation, which we run 2 or 3 times a year in the SEAI offices. To date, we have facilitated 5 contracts using kind of the EPC style contracts. So 4 of these have been performance contracts with 15 Dublin local authority public buildings. These were our 8-year contracts. They were mainly energy efficiency investments, so not as significant capital investments as we've seen with decarbonisation, but still €3 million overall. And the first of these contracts has actually finished last December. So, and then we also facilitated the Tala district heating system using an energy supply contract model, which is very much related to EPC. That was an €8 million project and a 10-year contract. And then in terms of current pipeline, we have 1 contract now coming towards the end of the procurement stage with South Dublin County Council. So I should say 6 buildings, they're not 8. And then we have about 6 EPC projects planned to go to tender then with across the Mid-East and with other Dublins this year as well. So we've got quite a good pipeline. Just very quickly, just touching on funding, one of the strengths of EPC, and probably why a lot of you might know of it, is about its ability to bring in funding to a project. It's only one of the benefits, but it is an important one. In our past projects, we managed to bring in about 38% of the funding from the private sector via ESCOs. We had 48% in grants, a little bit skewed by the CAF grant for the Tala district heating system. And then we had 14% coming in from the local authorities. I think the most important point there is that you can use performance contract to help bring a blended finance approach and bring in that private finance into these contracts, which I think will be very important in the future. So we really wanted to learn on the kind of positive experience we had with EPC in the early stages, and about 4 years ago, we started to develop plans to build on our project development experience. So we submitted an application to the Horizon 2020 Project Development Assistance Call, and we were successful, and we got funding for what has become DeliveREE, and we were only one of 5 projects funded in that call that year. Um, DeliveREE has 2 main goals: to create a project implementation unit and scalable delivery model that can be replicated across Ireland and Europe. So that's a little bit about what we're going to talk to you about today, and we will be publishing all the documents in relation to this in the coming weeks or the coming months. And in parallel, to make sure that this system was robust, we were testing that on various performance contracts. So we're currently in year 4. We've only really got 1 or 2 contracts, smaller contracts off the ground so far, so we're a little bit delayed, but we have a strong pipeline. We had lots of obstacles, and then not least kicking off during a COVID lockdown. But on the plus side, we do have a good, strong project implementation unit now in Codema, which we didn't have 4 years ago. And we have a quite robust project development process, which Emily will talk to you about. The overall aim of DeliveREE was to kind of create a systematic approach to building retrofits, kind of a one-stop shop, if so to speak, but really to standardize the project development process and to aggregate projects, and to not, by that I mean both buildings and measures. So to move away from just doing a heat pump or a solar panel and look at holistic building decarbonisation. So, and with that, to only use performance related or guarantee contracts, so they can be quite small or full on EPC. And this in turn enables bringing in a private finance. Um, Slides to move forward. So the initial aims of the project, we identified 19 projects across 140 local authority buildings, with an estimated capital of 20.4 million. Now it's probably a little bit of an underestimation, because we were looking at smaller projects, and a typical savings of around 29%. But we're also looking crucially at the kind of blended funding option as well. But that's what we set out to do. But like all plans, it didn't exactly work out like that. And kind of looking back on this and trying to understand why, I think when we prepared the proposal, we were very much thinking energy efficiency and kind of decarbonisation by association, in a sense, but that energy efficiency was leading the design thinking. But today it's flipped, and it's very much decarbonisation and kind of energy efficiency leading, are following. And from a design perspective, I feel one of them always has to lead and the other follows. And the consequence is that with focusing purely on decarbonisation, we sacrifice cost savings. It seems like a small change in focus, but it had a very big impact on the projects, as we'll see now, and how we shaped it up. The first impact was the shift was on the project pipeline itself. When we prepared the pipeline, we envisaged that we would have lots of projects over loads of buildings. So, replacing bits of heating systems and improvements. But the change in focus led to us to go back and particularly with the climate action plan, to go back and look at these buildings purely in terms of direct emissions. And this chart you can see before you is just an example from DeliveREE, but it's the buildings plotted in terms of direct CO2 emissions. And what you can see here is that there's a small number of buildings have a very big impact, and the vast majority of the remaining buildings have very little impact when you look at it purely from CO2. So and this picture is very much the same for all the local authorities we would have seen. And so to reach targets, you really have to focus on those totally decarbonisation of those larger buildings. So essentially this reshaped our pipeline and simplified things a lot, really, from looking at a lot of 140 buildings to approximately 40 over the whole project, but deeper measures with an aim of full decarbonisation. probably seems obvious now, but you do have to go through this process. The second consideration was how best to approach these buildings when it comes to EPC and how to communicate the approach. And this was really the result of a lot of initial, quite confused conversations we had about, trying to put all the bits together and where EPC fits with fabric first and deep retrofit and all the various approaches. So we produced this kind of what we call our decarbonisation strategy. Now it's very much a work in progress still, but it kind of gets the basic idea. But the idea is that you take your list of buildings that you're looking at, and the first consideration is always deep retrofit or turning the to go look at deep retrofit following kind of a traditional approach and very much fabric first. This can be challenging sometimes because it will and can mean turning some or all your building into a building site, and we have to be aware that energy efficiency and decarbonisation are not always going to be the main drivers for a deep retrofit decision. There's often other factors in there. Maybe the roof needs replacing, or the office building is no longer, comfortable to be in, or all the windows need to be replaced. There's other decisions that need to go in there that often make it difficult to get that deep retrofit decision. So instead of projects just stalling there, we would say if you can't do the deep retrofit, then you should look at decarbonisation. And decarbonisation is more starting in the plant room, replacing all the fossil fuel based equipment there, and then working your way out and doing what is absolutely necessary. Now, it's a slightly controversial clash between, energy efficiency first, fabric first approach there, but there is always a tension there. But it's really at the aim at getting everything to move. With the acknowledgement that like a decarbonised building will eventually be ready for deep retrofit at some stage in the future. Then following on from this, we had to really reconsider how we bundle our projects or how we put them to market. In our past projects, we generally took a large building like a leisure centre and maybe put it together with some smaller sports halls or smaller offices and put it to the market that way. And then we would have other small buildings that we would just tender in using a traditional model with a performance guarantee. And, it was generally split along the building size in that way and trying to create bundles that were big enough to go to the market to attract attention. Kind of found that just wasn't working anymore. And that small projects proved just as difficult and costly to procure as the bigger projects. So we kind of reviewed the process, and the real aim and the challenge was to try and keep the benefits of the performance guarantee approach, the kind of design build proof of savings approach, as we call it, in with the smaller buildings. So that measurement and verification and guarantee of performance is embedded in EPC, but how do we keep that in with smaller buildings where the economies of scale are not there so much? So what we are doing now, and we're trialing this now with the Mid East, is that we have two framework approaches. So we have a framework for performance contracts for the larger buildings. So we've set up a 19 million euro framework there for the leisure centres and the county halls. And then in parallel, we'll have a single party framework, or could be a multi-party framework operating on a cascade system, probably more likely, but where one contractor will essentially get the rights to all the remaining buildings. And we have 46 buildings there of significance in terms of decarbonisation. So essentially we'll be able to, for those 4 local authorities in Wicklow, Meath, Kildare and Louth, we will be able to have 2 frameworks set up to aim at design and installation of measures for decarbonisation of those buildings, which hopefully will free up the procurement a burden on all of those and bring in the kind of performance guarantee approach. The main goal here is really to move away from projects and into programs of works. And hopefully that can fit better with funding approaches as well. Another lesson that we've kind of learned is that we assumed we could just repeat what we had done in the past in terms of how we present these projects to the market. But with our first project that we went out under DeliveREE project, it basically stalled, kind of collapsed, and we had to go back and say why did that not work this time? And basically, when we looked at it, it was the shift in focus from energy efficiency to decarbonisation. Basically, resulted in higher project capital costs, mainly through heat pumps. Heat pumps. It resulted in higher project risk as a direct consequence of this, so both technical and financial. And this resulted in higher bid cost risk essentially to the contractors coming in. And it was mainly through a lot more design risks and more design being required at an early stage. So the contractors were not willing to basically take on this risk. So we had to go back kind of to the drawing board, and we essentially, at the same time, the infrastructure guidelines were being introduced. And I'm not going to talk too much about this chart because this is what Emily is going to cover. But basically, we had to relook at our full project development process, and align it so that helped in terms of creating a structure. But then, more importantly, again, how we procure the projects when we went out. So we use competitive dialogue, which is basically shortlist some contractors in stage one, and then you invite them into a competitive dialogue. And then in the past, we would have just issued, following the dialogue stage, and once we were comfortable that everybody was on board, we would issue our invitation to tender and go straight to contract award. Um, Now, because of the increased cost of projects and design risk, we're essentially awarding at a kind of more preliminary design stage, going to a kind of a preferred bidder approach, and maybe entering into a project development agreement, are adding this agreement stage to the contract award. So where the detailed design is then done once you've narrowed it down to one party, all on the agreement that the final cost cannot be greater than the initial tender costs. So this is something that's widely used in the private sector. It's also widely used in the UK and other countries. So it's something we're testing now with our initial projects here. Um, so, and then we're also bringing in, for the kind of detailed design phase, we'll be bringing in on the client side or local authority side a technical advisor to oversee, and also a QS or possibly a cost consultant to make sure that we really are getting value for money on these projects at this stage. And on that, like the real key metric that we're looking for is not euro invested, but euro invested per kilowatt hour saved, because that's the real thing we're looking for. Um, and then just to kind of finish off, one the most common question you'd still face, and I think most people would still ask, is why EPC? Why are we focused on performance contracting? I'm convinced it's more important than ever, but it is still very slow to take off. And I think after going through this project and process, I think it's largely in part to how we currently think about EPC and how we communicate it. So just very quickly, what is EPC? And this is a definition came from one of our earlier projects, but it's performance contracting is the provision of energy services with a guaranteed outcome. That's it. Not about finance or money. It's just about the guaranteed outcome. There are many variations of this across Europe, but basically, if it doesn't satisfy this, to me, it's not EPC. Um, and when we talk about EPC, we're essentially saying we want to move from this, where traditional contracting model, where the building owner is the kind of center of everything, or the project owner. It's an approach everybody knows well. That project owner's in full control. Everybody answers them. But with that, you take all the risks, increased costs of works, operation performance, system integration, and it's inefficient as it doesn't consider the overall building performance. And what we were trying to move to is this, which is essentially a design build proof of savings, or kind of a design build operate and maintain, really. But design build proof of savings is a simple way of thinking about it, where you want that designer, the installer, and the service and maintenance all linked together contractually. So when there are inevitable errors or overestimates in design, or whatever's design is not installed correctly, or that's not commissioned correctly, that is all picked up as part of the contract. And really what we're really focusing on is outputs. And we want to move away from buying the input, buying the technology, and to buying the output. So with traditional contracting, we'll buy the heat pump and the solar panel and hope it works as expected. But with EPC, we're trying to buy the heat or the electricity. So we see traditional contracting is essentially works only, whereas EPC is the works and the services. And by services, I mean the kind of maintenance and energy guarantee service. And the payments are directly linked to, or the contractor payments are linked to payment and profit. Why outputs? Well, main reason is the performance gap. And I think this is quite clearly illustrated in a report back from 2016 by Innovate UK. They followed 50 low energy design buildings. I think they were mainly new buildings, but they were all low energy design. They followed them over 5 years, and they found a performance gap averaging of 3.5. Or put simply, emissions were 250% higher than designers estimated during design on average for these commercial and public buildings, and sometimes considerably higher, as you can see here, like up to 10 times higher. And these are all modern energy efficiency, or energy efficient NZEB level buildings. And to me, this shows that focusing on the technology alone will not help us reach our targets. We're all kind of guilty of the kind of plug and play. We get the piece of kit, we put that in, solves all our problems. But we really have to focus on the performance. How does heat pumps and solar panels integrate with the existing building? And it shows that if we're focusing on energy and CO2, that the traditional contracting process is failing us. And it's a process that really we've been using for, I don't know, for the 20 years I've been in Codema. I haven't seen anything change on this front. So I think contractual performance guarantees can really help change this. And then in a final slide for myself, basically we see EPC as a pathway to zero carbon. So performance contracts, they provide a contract structure for a planned phase decarbonisation of buildings. They allow for the phasing out of existing assets if you have newer CHPs or boilers in your building, but you still want to get something going. And you can start to put this contract in place and have a phased plan for replacing them. Your contractor can help prepare an implementation plan, which you can put a structured investment plan together. And all of this helps to reduce the decision-making uncertainty and complexity for your building owner. And it's what we're beginning to think now of much more as a decarbonisation partnership. And with that, I'm going to hand you over to Emily. And I think we'll take some questions then at the end. Hopefully we'll have some time. So thank you.
Stuart, I'll just share my screen. Can you all see that? Yep. Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to talk about how to develop a decarbonisation partnership for an EPC. So a decarbonisation partnership is a collaborative approach to decarbonising an organisation's building portfolio. So it involves integrating a performance contract into the client's existing operations to achieve a holistic building decarbonisation. And the client is always at the centre of this process and works with a facilitator, which is our role, an ESCO, which is an energy services company, and finance where required. So Joe already explained a bit about DeliveREE in his presentation, but basically DeliveREE works to accelerate the delivery of energy upgrades using decarbonisation partnerships through the project implementation unit, which is within Codema. So the project implementation unit uses a project development process that involves procedures and templates which provide a structured toolkit to support project developers to delivering decarbonisation solutions in Ireland. So this ensures quality control, that we're using best practice project development methods, and that we're delivering a consistent product to the market. So decarbonisation partnerships use performance contracting to deliver the energy upgrades. Performance contracting, as Joe said, is the provision of energy services with a guaranteed outcome. So there are numerous procurement approaches and contracts that can be used, but as a starting point, the broad categories include energy performance contracts, which are best suited for a group of larger buildings with higher energy consumption, energy guarantees, which are ideal for lower value projects focusing on single technology, energy supply contracts, which are suitable for projects involving energy generation, such as district heating and solar PV. And these contracts can be procured via one-off tenders, or frameworks can be established to allow for streamlined ongoing procurement of these similar projects. So as Joe already mentioned, ESCOs are a business that provides energy efficiency, renewable energy, and decarbonisation solutions. And in the context of decarbonisation partnerships, a tender for a performance contract will result in an ESCO being procured to design and install the energy upgrades, maintain the installed equipment, and measure and verify the performance of equipment, guaranteeing energy savings or emissions reductions. The upgrades as part of these contracts focus on active energy equipment such as heat pumps, solar PV, LED upgrades, BMS and controls upgrades. Fabric may be included or may be done separately, but the focus is on measures that require active management to reduce energy consumption. So potential upgrades will be identified via a decarbonisation assessment at the beginning of the project development process, and the ESCOs will refine this during the procurement process, and the client will have final input into the measures before signing any contract. So just quickly, the benefits of a decarbonisation partnership. So where business as usual would result in small, low value single technology projects. This is a route to holistic building decarbonisation and a contracted pathway to net zero. Decarbonisation partnerships measure and verify the savings, so they guarantee the results, whereas business as usual, there's often poor results because there's no follow-up and no measurement and verification. The performance risk in a decarbonisation partnership is taken on by the ESCO, who is the technical expert, whereas in a traditional project, it's taken on by the client. And the client must also manage multiple contractors in a traditional contract, whereas the ESCO provides one face to the client in a decarbonisation partnership. And then finally, business as usual projects can also be difficult to finance, whereas decarbonisation partnerships can bring in third-party financing, which is usually done through the ESCO. So how do decarbonisation partnerships fit into existing systems? So where the project has a scope beyond just energy upgrades, a decarbonisation partnership will involve the PIU working with the organisation's architect teams to facilitate the development of energy upgrade projects. So the DeliveREE stakeholders, including the facilitator and the ESCO, will focus on what's inside the plant room, while the architects will take care of everything outside the plant room, like fabric upgrades, other retrofit elements, building regulations, and heritage and conservation requirements. In terms of the fabric first approach, a decarbonisation partnership focuses on the active energy equipment, so i.e. the plant room. Existing buildings are usually complex and contain a mess of different systems, and they also often operate on a cycle, so often 10 to 15 years for mechanical and electrical systems and 20 to 25 years for fabric, which can add complexity to retrofit decisions. And then, so that means that fabric first approaches may not always be appropriate or cost effective. But where fabric upgrades are identified as appropriate, the DeliveREE PIU can work with the client's architect-led design teams to ensure a comprehensive upgrade approach. A decarbonisation partnership can be also a practical tool within an energy management system. So while both processes are focused on improving energy efficiency and reducing energy consumption, an energy management system focuses on creating a structured approach for monitoring, measuring, and improving energy performance on an ongoing basis. And the decarbonisation partnership can deliver the equipment upgrades to implement the measures identified within the energy management system. So there are also synergies. So both processes rely on accurate energy data. So an energy monitoring system, energy management system to continuously monitor energy performance, and an EPC uses the data to measure and verify savings. The energy efficiency obligation scheme also places obligations on energy suppliers and distributors to meet specific energy targets. So the providers can work with the client to implement energy savings measures, which can be traded, sold, or transferred to meet their obligations. So decarbonisation partnership will enable the installation of energy upgrades and the subsequent measurement and verification of energy savings. And the organisation can reinvest these savings into facilitation services or further energy projects, for example. Then in the context of climate targets, a decarbonisation partnership will not only enable the energy upgrade projects to work towards the targets, but will ensure that the savings from these projects are guaranteed, so that the client can have more confidence in meeting the targets after the investment. And a gap to target assessment will be performed on the whole portfolio to assess what projects are required to meet the various targets. A decarbonisation partnership will also leverage and provide application support for funding and financing opportunities, including the SEI Pathfinder support, and other grants where relevant, and also financing through the ESCO. So the DeliveREE project development process ensures compliance with the Pathfinder funding requirements. And then the infrastructure guidelines. So the Irish government has published the infrastructure guidelines, which set out value for money guidance for the evaluation, planning, and management of public investment projects in Ireland. And the DeliveREE project development process ensures compliance with these guidelines. So this is just a diagram of our project development process. So on the right, you can see the project development stages. So we begin with an organisation-wide decarbonisation pathway, which basically performs a gap to target assessment on the organisation's portfolio and identifies the most relevant buildings for upgrade. Then we move on to the appraisal stage, which involves a decarb. So that identifies measures that might be appropriate for upgrade. Then we move on to the project initiation stage, which involves creating a business case and doing financial analysis, and the client decides at this point whether to proceed or not to procurement. Then the procurement process effectively contracts an ESCO, who will then take on the lead role from then on, and they will perform the developed and detailed design, any post-procurement requirements, pre-works, installation of works, any works completion requirements like commissioning and handover, and then the services and operations stage. So ongoing maintenance and repair and measurement and verification of the measures. So within each stage, there are also a number of procedures to be followed, but I won't go into this much detail. So the infrastructure guidelines also has 3 approval gates, which projects must go through. So for projects below 20 million, a project must gain approval at gates 1 and 3. And so the approval gates align with the project stages as shown in the figure above. So yeah, I guess the projects are developed, each project stage is broken up into multiple packages of work, which are called procedures, which must be followed to ensure important project development tasks are being completed and consistent and standardized projects are brought to the market. So there's a procedural document to describe each procedure to ensure that timing, dependencies, relevant templates, relevant guidelines, any subtasks and outputs are consistent between the projects. And templates are created for all the outputs of the project implementation unit. So such as reports for the client, procurement documentation, checklists to oversee ESCO work, etc. And these templates accompany the procedures to create a standardized project development process. The DeliveREE project development process will also be constantly reviewed and updated to maintain relevance to the Irish context. And as you saw during Joe's presentation, over the last 4 years of the DeliveREE project, we've been doing just that. So we started off with a version of this project development process that looks quite different to what it is today. And we've been incorporating our learnings throughout the project to come up with what we have today, which is a relevant toolkit for the current market. So this is just an example of what our current project development matrix looks like. So you can see we've got the project stages, and then we've got multiple procedures within each stage. And then each procedure has a procedural document to go with it. So I won't go into too much detail, but this should give you an idea of how it works. And these are just examples of our procedural documents on the left. So you can see that they're all the same, but just different content for each procedure. And then some templates. So yeah, document templates, report templates, financial analysis, for example. Basically everything that we do should be in a template. So a decarbonisation partnership will involve multiple stakeholders, and a facilitator can bridge and balance the different stakeholder interests. So for example, the client wants cost savings, improved efficiency and risk minimization. The ESCO, who might seek profitable returns on efficiency investments and technical feasibility, and the financial community, who prioritize financial viability and risk management. A facilitator also manages the project development process from initial concept to implementation and evaluation, providing an important project management resource, which is often not a capacity the client has in-house. So this role includes defining project scope, objectives and milestones, ensuring compliance with regulations, standards and best practices, and coordinating with all stakeholders to maintain project alignment, managing risks, timelines and troubleshooting issues as they arise. So a facilitator will bring unique expertise and skills in energy efficiency and performance contracting, such as energy audits, financial modelling, procurement and tendering, and an understanding of performance contracts. And with multiple stakeholders involved, disputes can also arise over costs, performance guarantees or risk allocation, and a facilitator can mediate and provide conflict resolution and ensure contracts and procurement documentation clearly define roles, risks and penalties to prevent disputes. A facilitator is also an independent third party who can ensure transparency, will remain neutral and ensures that the decision making is fair, objective and well documented. And And this involves establishing clear procurement and evaluation criteria, providing unbiased technical and financial assessments, documenting all negotiations and agreements for accountability, and ensuring open communication between stakeholders. So the contract will be tailored for the needs of each specific project. So for low complexity single technology projects, this timeline may be as simple as a short design stage, a short works phase, and a guarantee period that's long enough to prove the commissioning. So that could be as low as 2 months up to a full yearly cycle, 12 months. And then for higher complexity whole building decarbonisation projects, this may include a 3 to 6 month design phase, a works phase lasting 6 to 12 months, and a guarantee period that can be tailored to the needs of the client. So considerations that might result in a longer contract include higher investment from the ESCO, one face to the client for maintenance, ongoing proof of savings, while a shorter contract may be preferred where the client wants to prove the savings, but there is low ESCO investment and the client is confident to manage the energy systems and maintain the savings. So this is what the payment mechanism looks like. So we've got the baseline energy cost in the darker blue on the left here. Then once the contract begins, it should reduce the energy costs thanks to the performance-based solution. And the savings can be used to pay the ESCO for the implementation of the measures, operation and maintenance, any financing, and taking on the risk, the technical risk. And then after the contract ends, all those additional savings go to the customer, as well as any operation and maintenance costs. So how is the client involved in this process? Basically, the client is at the heart of the EPC process. So while the market often favors ESCOs or financial institutions, engaging a facilitator can help rebalance the process and ensure that the client's interests remain the primary focus. So since clients are not typically EPC experts, they rely on the facilitator for guidance and support throughout the project development, as well as other external consultants, such as technical advisors, cost consultants, to provide technical and cost guidance. So the client plays a key role in decision-making at the critical milestones, including initiating the project, proceeding to procurement, and awarding the contract. So I've already explained the facilitator and the ESCO roles, but the additional roles include the funder. So if the project is eligible for grant funding, a funder becomes a key stakeholder. So for Pathfinder sponsored projects, SEI will be involved, and the client must meet specific deliverables and provide necessary documentation throughout the project development process. Financiers, so in lower value projects, financing is typically introduced through the ESCO. However, there are also other financing options available. And while this project development process outlines best practices for project development, it doesn't specifically address specific financing requirements, which would need to be tailored on a case-by-case basis. Technical advisors. So a technical advisor is typically engaged to provide expert technical guidance and support during the procurement, design, and works phases of the project. So the technical advisor's role may include attending procurement meetings, performing energy efficiency design reviews, monitoring the works implementation, and commissioning oversight. And then a quantity surveyor or a cost consultant is typically engaged in an EPC project to ensure that the client receives value for money throughout the contract. So they play a key role in reviewing ESCO proposals during the procurement phase, helping to assess the financial viability of the energy savings measures and ensuring alignment with project goals. And during the design phase, they monitor project costs, ensuring that the proposed solutions remain within budget and identify any potential financial risks. So this is just a diagram comparing a traditional project development process to a performance guarantee. So at the top, you can see the traditional process where the client does the appraisal and the project initiation. They procure the design, they get engineers to do the design, and then they procure the work. They get a works contractor, and then the client also has to operate the building afterwards. Whereas in the performance guarantee, a facilitator will lead the appraisal and initiation phases, as well as the procurement phase, with obviously oversight and approval from the client. And then the ESCO will lead the design, works, and operation phases, with oversight and approval from the client. So these are just some key kind of client decision points. So basically, up until the project initiation stage, I guess it's the initial project development, and then the client will make the decision to proceed to procurement based on the business case that's been developed, and then during the procurement stage, the client will sign the contract, and then after the ESCO performs the design, the client will also make the decision whether to proceed to the works phase. So that's basically the project development process. In the coming months, we'll be uploading how-to guides and procedures, all the procedures basically that I talked about, and the templates we'll be uploading to our DeliveREE hub, and also brochures explaining the DeliveREE process. So you can find these at the Codema website in the DeliveREE hub. And you can also follow our community of best practice on LinkedIn, find out more. And yeah, that's it from me. Thanks everyone. And yes, we'll move on to our Q&A session now. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to write them in the chat.
Great, thanks very much, Emily. I do see a question in there earlier from Rosie in relation to the two frameworks that I mentioned, that we're setting up for the Mid-East. So Rosie, you asked what organizations can participate in those two frameworks. So at the moment, we just set up the frameworks for the 4 local authorities involved. The reason, like, frameworks and ESCO frameworks have been really big in kind of the UK in the past, but the problem was in Ireland now, I suppose at the scale of project we've been involved in with local authorities, there was only a very small, treat for ESCOs involved. And part of the DeliveREE project as well is to try and encourage and develop the ESCO market as much as possible. So I always held off on setting up frameworks that kind of could be seen to preclude new entrants in a way. But we did do it for the Mid-East because we had a very defined project pipeline there. And I think that'll work well. And the second framework we haven't advertised yet, but we hopefully will attract more people on that. They are also kind of something we're trialing in some way. So, but I do think as we go forwards and the market develops a little bit in Ireland and we have a little bit more competition, there's definitely a case for standardization is really important, and for more wider education sector, university framework, or a public sector wide framework as they do in the UK as possible. And then I see Paul had a question there around the infrastructure guidelines. I don't know if we'll be able to answer.
I see that. Yeah, what are the criteria for the approval gates? Yeah, so I guess you can find these in the infrastructure guidelines, which is up on the infrastructure guidelines website, I guess. But basically for there's like several requirements for each stage. For the first phase, first approval gate, you're required to do a preliminary business case, state aid assessment, and I think some other things as well. And then the third approval gate is things like a final business case, and yeah, I think there's some other requirements. Sorry, I don't have them listed in front of me. But yeah, you'd probably get a better list of those by going to the infrastructure guidelines website.
Okay, thanks, Emily. And then there was just one other question there for Paul, saying how could a facilitator be involved in the procurement phase before the design is complete by the ESCO? So a lot of this has got to do with how we procure the projects, and by using competitive dialogue and focusing on that. That's the procurement procedure that lets us focus on the output based procurement that I mentioned in my presentation. So the role of the facilitator is just to initially you talk to somebody to have an idea for a project. The first exercise is this actually of a scale, and is it can it be presented as an EPC project to the market? So there's an initial feasibility assessment, but it's quite high level. And that's where a facilitator would be involved in broad estimations around heat pump costs, heat pump sizes, all of that. And it's that kind of broad assessment, or maybe a little bit more, that we'll take to the market, and the contractors will then start doing that initial design. But the detailed design actually doesn't take place until after contract award now with these projects. There's a good bit in that, and Paul, we can take that offline if you want, and I can explain a little bit further. And then Rosie, a question there again. Do you think EPCs are still valid without the decarbonisation? Yes, of course. Basically, we're being a little bit cheeky, or probably be a little bit inventive. One of the very first pieces of analysis myself and Emily did for this project was an interview. We interviewed a lot of EPC experts across Europe. The main first conclusion we came out is that we can't be sure that we're all mean the same thing when we say EPC. It's one of these terms, and it's also, I think, from somebody who's given an awful lot of presentations on EPC, I think a lot of people switch off when they hear EPC as well, and because it's something that's been around for so long as a concept, and there's a genuine question of like, why isn't it working? If it has, so the decarbonisation approach, or decarbonisation partnership, is almost a rebranding of EPC. That's all we're saying, because essentially, but I think EPC and energy efficiency, and now EPC and decarbonisation, there is a slight change there that has to be recognised, and I think decarbonisation is more of a journey for some buildings rather than just a project. I think that's what we're trying to get around as well, especially with costs involved and planning and phasing out of systems and bringing in new systems. That's not all going to happen overnight. And even with our first EPC projects, there was continuous works throughout the projects. That's the reality in the ground. So that's what it's essentially trying to rebrand it and come up with some gotcha. Okay, look, we're just, if there's not any more questions, look, we might conclude it there. We're just right on time. And I think, Katia, did you want to say something about the escapes me now, the information
community of best practice?
Yes.
Yes. So we're trying to get this going at the moment, and we've set up LinkedIn group some time ago. And yeah, it would be great if anyone has any further questions, if you can even join the group and you can post them there if you'd like. And then as well, just to finish that, we will also be circulating a recording. We'll be putting this recording up on YouTube, and then we can also circulate the slides presented and a link to further resources if participants would like.
Excellent. So thanks very much, everybody, for taking time out to join us. And yeah, as Kathy said, we'll share everything with you after any of this. So we'll close it there. So thank you.